Hi, Dave Sussman back here at CPAC 2017, and I want to introduce everybody to somebody that's fascinating. We met here at CPAC this week. His name is Jackson Darr. He's a political consultant, but one of the reasons we wanted to interview Jackson is because he's very much focused on polling. And as a data monkey, if you will, Jackson, welcome.
Yes.
As a data monkey, if you will, talk to us a little bit about what you're currently seeing right now with general coalition shifts that are happening.
So we're at the end of sort of a coalition shift cycle. People think that coalitions are always shifting one way or another all the time, but really it's big jumps, especially geographically. So one year in one state you might see a cluster of counties move hard one way, but then they don't move again for a while, but next time a different one moves either the same way or a different way in another part of the state. Pennsylvania is a good example. I was able to predict that Trump could win Pennsylvania simply by looking at which areas hadn't had a big shift in a while. That would be northeastern Pennsylvania, and say, look, eventually this shift, given the kinds of voters that live there, white, working class, generally blue collar, generally culturally conservative, that it would happen eventually. Wasn't sure if it would happen under Trump or not, but I could tell that Pennsylvania was going to go Republican in the next couple of elections.
Based on what? Just that there are shifts occasionally, or every several years. What is it? Is it the San Andreas Fault argument?
Yeah, it is. I mean, voting is a tendency. It's a behavior, and people don't always all make up their minds at the same time. So, some guy who's a union fitter in Washington State, he's probably still voting Democratic, right? Because the composition of that local Democratic Party tends to make him, and where he lives, tends to make him a lot more socially liberal than you would expect for a union pipe fitter. But a union pipe fitter in Michigan, he's a swing voter right now. And he's probably going to be a pretty Republican voter in a while. Why? Because he's from an area that's more culturally conservative, and so it's an easier sell to him. He's already there on half the issues. Same thing goes for suburban independents kind of going more Democratic. A lot of them are already kind of there on half the issues, and it's kind of a 50-50 deal for them. And Trump was the straw that broke the camel's back. But a lot of them tend to move at once, and so you get these big jumps, and that's what allows, especially surprise wins, like what happened with Trump. If it all moves at one time, if a bunch of people in a bunch of different regions all do it at one time, then it can create this big shift, and you won't see it again for a while. Or the next one will be very Democratic.
So if there's not going to be another shift for a while, does that bode well for Trump's reelection?
It bodes fairly well, especially because he's an incumbent, and when you're an incumbent, a lot of your people tend to stick with you. I mean, George W. Bush increased his margin, right?
In 2004.
In 2004, right. And there will be somewhat of a consolidation. You're already seeing a bunch of fairly never Trump people, especially a lot of people who voted for Gary Johnson. You're already seeing a lot of them come over to Trump. Now he's going to bleed even more in the suburbs. You'll see, I think, even bigger shifts against the GOP in especially well-heeled suburbs in 2020. But they won't be that big, probably, because a lot of the shift there has already taken place. The next big shift will probably be very Democratic, but it won't be for a couple of elections.
How much of a role in data, and as you call yourself as a data monkey, how much of a role does what media and the general consensus on trends, whether it's identity politics or concerns about nationalism, play in seeing these trends happening?
It actually plays a fairly large role on a grand scale. It matters because, let's say a political movement gets really behind an issue. If they can get a lot of favorable media coverage all at once, it has a magnifying effect. And it doesn't stop long-term trends in specific geographic areas, which is very important. You have to remember, geographic areas matter. But what it does do is it can accelerate them. So a lot of these areas have shifted towards Trump, outstate Minnesota, certain parts of Michigan, certain parts of Pennsylvania. If you hadn't had huge coverage of Trump, calling him all these names and saying that he was this thing that a lot of people in those areas wanted, the media coverage basically had blowback, where they were saying, oh, he's anti-immigrant and he's anti-trade and that's terrible, and all those people heard was anti-immigrant and anti-trade, heck yeah, that's my jam. And they're like, great, awesome, and they all shifted at once. instead of it occurring over a bunch of different election cycles, different places at different times.
So it could actually perpetuate those trends and those cycles.
It can't really stop them, but it can accelerate or slow them down, depending on how much coverage something gets and what gets coverage.
We're seeing certain states, California, Washington, Oregon, New York, Maryland, very deep blue, extremely deep blue. Does your model that you believe is basically a trend? I mean, California for the past 20 years has gone so blue. There's no Republican office.
So when you look at these blue states, you have to break it out, and it sucks that we have to talk about it this way, but you have to break it out by race. There's just no other. Right now, I think there's going to be some racial coalition shifts. You're already seeing over the past 2 elections a bit more of shifting of the black vote to Republicans than you would have thought, especially among younger black men. I think almost 20% for Mitt Romney of young black men. But that's sort of on the horizon. Right now you have to look at that, and when you look at that, what you see is that a lot of these states are a lot wider than you would expect, say Washington and Oregon, right? Those are actually not bad targets for Republicans in the future. Now, the kind of white people that tend to be the swing voters there are generally pretty socially liberal, but as the party generally becomes more secular...
Well, outside in Washington, outside of Kings County, it's a fairly conservative state.
Right. And you saw shifts towards Trump out on the peninsula where you think the hippies live. Like, there are all the loggers, all the fishermen, they loved him. He won the peninsula.
Right.
Which never happens for any Republican. You know, he didn't win the Boeing areas north of Seattle. That's what I was talking about, the socially liberal pipe fitter kind of guy. But he won out on the peninsula because they were rural areas, and it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for them. The party got more secular and more anti-trade. Suddenly they're on board because racial stuff and religious affiliation are really big cultural signals. And whether you have or don't have any of those things really matters to how people emotionally feel, and a lot of voting is based on feeling.
So are you suggesting that if Trump wanted to increase his voter rolls in those particular states, that he does what? Focus on ethnicities?
No, you wouldn't want to focus on ethnicities because A, that's being too obvious, and that's just going to piss off the other ethnicities.
Agreed.
You don't want to do that. So what you want to do is because most of the people in those states are of a certain ethnicity, right, or at least are white, because a bunch of different white ethnicities, all you have to do is try to say you're a uniter, right? I'm for doing this. I'm not going to divide anybody. And that's basically a signal that says, I'm not going to favor one group over the other. And if one group thinks that another group is being favored over them already, that's a plus to them. So if you are, let's say you're Asian and you're angry that someone is getting into college over, maybe it's a white person, maybe it's a black person, maybe it's a Hispanic person, over your kid because your kid's Asian and they're being discriminated against, which happens in some states. If someone comes along and says, hey, I just want to treat everyone equally, that's a plus for you because you're not being treated equally, right? And the people who are getting the special treatment are already getting the special treatment. They're not going to like you anyway.
It's interesting because, we're having these discussions and, the whole purpose of, for many people on the left, is identity politics.
Right.
And that is a massive, huge, if not the number one tool, is to divide.
Yes, definitely.
And put people into little groups and then, put them in buses and take them to the polls.
And it slows down assimilation. That's one of the major, and this is what I wanted to really get to. The long-term trend, at least for over a century, of how the parties in the U.S. grow is very consistent. Two things happen. One, first, three things happen. The Democrats register a bunch of new immigrants that come in. Maybe they're second generation, maybe they're first generation coming off of Ellis Island when anyone could get in and immediately get citizenship. But that's what they do. They concentrate on getting that growing vote. And they do very well at it, very well. You had 80% of Italians voting Democratic at one point. But then, over time, more generations happen, people assimilate more, and the Democratic Party starts to ignore those groups that they had spent so much time paying attention to before. And as those groups, again, start to assimilate and get less attention, they start separating out on what their actual opinions are. Mm-hmm. Some of them more successful, some of them are less successful, some of them, are socially conservative still, some of them aren't anymore. And Republicans take a chisel and pick off pieces of the coalition. Now, at the same time, the Democrats are always bringing in more, so they keep their numbers up. But the Republicans generally work as a party of addition whereas but taking from someone else. Whereas the Democrats work as a party of physically growing their base.
It's fascinating, and I think this is a discussion that we could certainly continue having. People can find you. Is it RRH Elections?
Yes, I'm one of the moderators on there. We're a Republican-leaning, elections-focused website.
Great.
With a daily roundup.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackson Darr. Appreciate your time. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate you, David.
Thanks.